Are we wasting our huge investment in the trolley? San Diego leaders are all talk but little follow-through when it comes to trolley stations and smart growth. The right to die, right to vote, right to use medical pot, even the right to use a clothesline were among the slew of new laws signed by Governor Brown. And David Bennett, the new man heading the San Diego Opera, is being blamed for the closure of New York's Gotham Chamber Opera. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are reporter Andrew Keats of Voice of San Diego. Hi, Andy.
How's it going, Mark?
Good to see you today. Michael Smolin's politics editor for the San Diego Union Tribune. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Mark.
Glad to have you back. And Angela Carone, arts and culture reporter for KPBS News. Hi, Angela.
Hi, Mark.
Well, a UC Berkeley study gave San Diego lousy grades for failing to promote density and walkable, affordable neighborhoods around transit stops. It's a fascinating look at how our region says one thing and does another. But before we get to that story, we've got a news update on a related story involving the proposed Lilac Hills development in rural North County. Andy, give us the quick thumbnail, the ABCs, on what Lilac Hills is.
So it's a project that would put 1,700 homes and associated a school, some commercial development, that sort of thing, in 600 acres of mostly undeveloped semi-rural land in the North Valley Center Bonsall area.
Okay, and the big problem with this, according to its critics, is it kind of busts the county's smart growth plan. This isn't smart growth.
Right, and which is a new plan. I mean, this is not the case, for instance, with One Paseo, which was a proposed change to the Carmel Valley plan, but the Carmel Valley plan was written in the 70s, so it was much easier to make the case that things had changed since then, and that it was, the problem was that the plan was outdated. The county's plan is just 4 years old, and it was years and millions of dollars went into making that plan, and for just 4 years later to propose a change that is this drastic
in a big new development.
Yeah, it certainly raises the question of what is the point of planning in the first place.
All right, and our news this week involved one of the supervisors voting on that plan.
Yeah, so there's a number of things that are pretty interesting and somewhat controversial about Lilac Hills. One of them is that the supervisor for the area, Bill Horn, owns over 30 acres of property just over a mile away. And so the question is, if you turn this area that is mostly undeveloped, mostly rural, into a population center with 1,700 homes, you're fundamentally changing the surrounding area as well. And it would then only make sense to extend that thought of development in the area right around it. And if you do that, then those 30 acres that Supervisor Horn currently uses for farming suddenly make a lot more sense for this same type of development. And if that happens, his vote to approve the plan would, down the line, give him the possibility of getting a direct financial increase.
And so the folks at the state, the Fair Political Practices folks, said you can't vote on it.
Yeah, so this summer when I looked into it, we called the FPPC and said, has Horn reached out to you at all? And they said, no, we haven't heard anything. Since then, he conferred with legal counsel for the county, and they put together a letter and said, do I in fact have a conflict of interest? People have raised this possibility. And the FPPC determined, yes, you do.
Okay.
You shouldn't vote.
And there's no appeal. So we're going to have 4 supervisors voting on that, and we'll just have to see how that vote goes.
Yeah, and 4 supervisors, if it's a tie vote, that's essentially a no
vote.
So they need to get 3 out of the remaining 4 supervisors.
All right, we'll watch that one closely on Lilac Hills. All right, let's shift back to the study of the transit rail stations. Who did that study, and what were they looking at?
So it was a nonprofit group called Next 10, and then a Center for Law and the Environment at UC Berkeley. Okay. And there was a little bit of miscommunication with what the study meant when it first came out. They organized the study by transit agencies, and then they put a letter grade next to it. So I think there was a range of people who thought that this was saying that MTS had failed to develop stations well. But what it was actually saying was, after the transit agency built these transit lines and all the stations on them, the surrounding jurisdictions had done an especially bad job of making the sort of development decisions that would capitalize on that investment.
Okay, so you've got a trolley here, you've got trolley stations, transit, public transit. The idea is to get these walkable, dense, livable neighborhoods, take advantage of that public transit, get people out of cars.
Yeah, people don't use cars because they have just some desperate desire to drive. They do it because it's easier, and the way you make it easier to use transit is to make people's jobs and homes near transit. And that happens when developers propose projects and cities approve projects right next to stations, and that basically hasn't happened.
Okay. Now, we do have a clip here of Eric Brewald, National University. He's talking about the huge investment we've made in the trolley and what must be done. Let's hear that.
The region's making billion-dollar investments, actually $1.7 billion to build a trolley from Old Town up to the University City area. It's going to spend several $billion building managed lanes on its freeways so that we can have both carpools and rapid buses go up and down those. There's long-term plans to extend the trolley out to East Lake and to communities in the eastern part of Chula Vista. So we're going to be building the infrastructure. The question is, are we going to leverage that infrastructure, or are we going to export our housing out to southern Riverside County and have tens, if not hundreds of thousands people stuck on I-15 for 8 hours a day?
All right, so he's kind of laying it out there, what we're talking about with smart growth and the transit station. So what is it? What are we really doing? We're talking a game, but we're not really playing the game.
Yeah, I mean, if you pay attention to local politics or local policy issues, you hear about this stuff all the time. The city has adopted a general plan that says, you know, it's called City of Villages is the mantra. It's, you know, develop these dense clusters in areas where people can live and work near transit, and so they don't need to rely on a car. Maybe if you have a family, instead of having 2 cars, you have 1 car, right? So you give people reasonable options to walk and take transit. But the plans haven't haven't parlayed themselves into anything in the world of development. So you look at, you know, Eric mentions the $1.7 billion investment to extend the trolley from Old Town to UTC. Well, you know, the city looked ahead and said, well, if we're going to be doing this, then we should probably adopt some new plans for what the development restrictions are going to be like along that corridor. And they did all of this. They got some money to study the area, and they proposed some changes in 2 stations in Linda Vista and Bay Park, and that would have raised the height limit and would have made it possible to build more densely right around those stations, and residents revolted. And that's certainly their right to do so. They said, this is not the quality of life that we bought into in this neighborhood. We don't want these changes to happen.
And the politicians backed down.
And they backed down immediately. All right? So the question is, if we're going to lay out these goals, and if we're going to say that we're doing so because it's important to take advantage of these large investments, what do you do when people tell you that they don't want this sort of thing? Because if you're just going to back down, then it would probably make more sense not to make the transit investments in the first place.
Right. Michael, do you think the political will is ever going to be here to stand up to these folks and say, no, here's how we're going to plan these neighborhoods?
Well, for decades they've been talking about building in the urban core along transportation corridors, and even before the trolley came up. And that just hasn't happened to the degree that anybody has envisioned, and they keep talking about it, and now they're building trolley lines along the way. You know, Eric mentioned the trolley line up to UTC and UC San Diego. And it'll be interesting because I think along the way, not just in those areas you mentioned, but they're anticipating more development that is more urban-like, trolley-like density. And I think the political opposition will be even stronger in those neighborhoods. You know, as you get farther north, those are more well-to-do areas and so forth. So right. There is a real question. We talked with some people from the San Diego Association of Governments and brought that issue up, that what Andrew mentioned, where they backed down on these 2 particular station areas. And they kind of dismiss it as, well, that's just a one-off situation. Well, you know, you talk to some people in North Park, they're not willing to take a lot of density and stuff like that. So that's going to be a constant battle along the way. And it does raise the question as, will they get the bang for the buck out of the trolley? I think a lot of the trolley was based on a lot more people using it.
Now, the Berkeley study, and we got a few seconds left on this, but I did want to touch this point. They said San Francisco does it pretty well.
Yeah.
What are they doing that we haven't done? Is it different geography up there or more of a culture of public transit?
Well, one thing I would say about San Francisco is that the nature of its transit investment was fundamentally different, that they built it in an area that already had some density. We have kind of worked it backwards, where we've built...
You build it, the density will come.
The density will come, and that's not what has happened. Yeah. And, you know, to Sandag's point that the Bay Park situation was a one-off event, what this study actually shows is that it's not a one-off event. It was always easier previously to dismiss these as anecdotes. Mm-hmm. But what we have now is a situation that puts in context that San Diego is in fact worse than every other metro area in California at following through on its transit investment.
All right, well, that is a story we're going to have to stay on top of, and I know we'll be doing many follow-ups to come there. Appreciate that. We're going to shift gears now. Governor Brown made national news by signing both the right to die and equal pay for women laws in recent days, but those bills were among many bills on important issues he dealt with as the legislative session wrapped up. So, Michael, let's start with the right to die. What does that bill do?
Well, Mark, it basically allows somebody that's diagnosed as terminally ill within 6 months to get a prescription for lethal medication. They have to go through a lot of steps. They need to make They need to tell 2 doctors, make oral presentations basically, or oral requests, and then a couple weeks later need to make a written request that's witnessed by somebody. There's a lot of concern, are people going to feel coerced into doing this either by others or that they don't want to burden people with, a long-term illness? So that's where the law will be heading and allow people to do that. But it was really interesting for Governor Brown because the weight on Governor Brown was tremendous. As we all know, that he was raised Catholic. He studied as a Jesuit seminarian, and the Catholic Church was heavily opposed and lobbying heavily against this. So he was feeling a lot of pressure there. But in the end of the day, he approved it, and his bill signing statement was very eloquent, and he brought it down to what I think a lot of people feel, that there was a lot of conflict in there, but that he just felt that if he were in that situation, he thinks he would take comfort knowing that option were there, whether he took advantage of it or not. And what's interesting is that in Oregon, which has had a right to die law for some time, they've been able to study it. And I was surprised to find that a lot of people that basically go through all the hoops and get these lethal drugs don't take them, but it's just having that option there. A lot do avail themselves to the
but having that
option.
power, it's empowering.
Yeah.
I did want to know, it was interesting how you described his difficulty in deciding this, but he also vetoed the so-called right to try bill. Tell us about that. Is that
well,
a contradiction
he
for the
was
governor?
actually, I think, skewered quite a bit for being contradictory because here's another case where you're dealing with terminally ill people, and the push was to give access to drugs that show promise that are in the testing process. So it's not like just drugs that, some herbal remedy or something like that. These are things that are going through the FDA process, but just not fast enough. And he said that his rationale was that the FDA is trying to streamline that. Let's let that work first. Well, that doesn't give a lot of comfort to somebody that's terminally ill. Right. But also that some people said, well, look, you did this for people that want to die, but you're not helping out the people that want to live.
Yeah.
So it was there were several contradictions in his bill signings and vetoes that had people scratching their heads.
All right, let's move on to equal pay for women. We got a lot to cover here. I want to do this in such a rapid fire deal, but how big a deal is this for this new state law? I got some national coverage.
Yeah, it's important. It's the strongest equal pay law or legislation in any state that, as far as we're told. We'll just have to see how it plays out. It is against the law to discriminate on a number of fronts in California, including pay, but people don't think it's strong enough. And one of the key elements that this bill does is it allows comparative jobs, not identical jobs. So it's not, an editor to an editor. It might be, an editor to an executive editor if those jobs for some reason are similar. The critics say that there's just a lot of vagueness in this, and they think it's going to be a field day for attorneys because trying to justify whether your job and my job are essentially equal is something that's really going to be hashed out in court. So a lot of people see the potential for a lot of lawsuits. But at the end of the day, they're looking to, balance the playing field or even it off. So particularly women can, who we know are earning less overall in general than men, will have more tools to try to rectify that.
Angel, as a woman, do you think it's an important step in California, even symbolically?
I think symbolically.
Yeah. Oh, do you?
But again, I think it's going to see how it shakes out. The number of lawsuits that can come from this. The critics are right about that, right? It seems like that could be a real problem. But I do think symbolically it's important. It's obviously a big issue. It's going to be parts of a national campaign for president. So we'll see. Puts
managers, business owners on record.
Yeah.
You've got to treat people fairly and equally. All right, let's move on. Nearly 20 years ago, voters in this state compassionately voted in medical marijuana for AIDS patients, cancer patients, any number of things, glaucoma patients here, been controversial ever since. Finally, it's taken that long. We've got guidelines in place. What does this law do? Are these guidelines finally going to work in California on how to distribute and sell medical marijuana?
Well, at its base, it sets a statewide standard and a statewide structure. Localities can pass their own laws, as the city of San Diego does, which dovetails well with this, and they can even pass stronger laws, but that would be the baseline. What's interesting is I think by March 1st, a locality will have to act, or they have to abide by the state law. Cities can still, ban medical marijuana dispensaries, but they need to do so by them. It's sort of like a statute of limitations. If you haven't done it and it's just something that's not being dealt with, so we might see some action as people trying to create their own ordinances, either bans or shape their own ordinances so that it fits their city more, along with dovetailing with the state. But ultimately, there's this big regulatory situation, an agency that's being created, and that's going to test marijuana for its potency and whether it's safe and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff that down the line that has to happen. But the other large aspect of this is that many people expect by next year voters will approve marijuana legalization overall for recreational use. And that this will be the framework to govern that. So you won't suddenly have a situation like we had with medical marijuana for 15 years, like suddenly, oh, here's this whole new use of marijuana that's unregulated. So they're trying to get ahead of the curve in that regard.
Put that in play. Let's touch on the racial profiling. Shirley Weber, San Diego legislator, got that one through. What does that do?
Well, what it basically requires is law enforcement agencies, police agencies, to collect data of everybody they stop, demographic data, particularly, perceived ethnic background. Sometimes it's not always easy, but, are they stopping proportionally more black or Latinos or Asians or whatever? That isn't necessarily collected now, and so they would have to produce reports that show that, and as we know, statistically, a lot of law enforcement agencies tend to stop people of color more often. Sometimes maybe there's a rationale for that, but at least they'll have data to start working from on that.
Look at the trends and the studies on that.
Certain law enforcement agencies and unions don't like that at all. They think that, first of all, it's not proven that this does really anything in terms of racial profiling. And secondly, it's just a huge administrative burden to start logging all this information. But they tend to say that about every new requirement that they're forced to.
So we'll see how that one plays out when they start gathering it. All right, we've saved the best for last. My favorite one here, the Right to Dry bill. And you've loved this for years. Tell us about the Right to Dry bill.
Mark, this will give a little age, but I covered a young Republican progressive back then supervisor named Roger Hedgecock. He wasn't quite the conservative type that he is now. And in Rancho Bernardo at a community meeting, and back then it was mostly retired folks, and they used to hang their clothes on the line. They wanted to know why they couldn't, because the CC&Rs of that community
hang the undies on the clothesline.
It was during one of the an energy crisis, and they talked about looking into that. They didn't have a problem with people's boxers being hung on a line, but apparently some folks do. So what this law does, it basically allows. If there are rules against it, it bans those rules. There are certain exceptions. If there's communal areas, you can't put up your lines and stuff. But I've been a practitioner of putting stuff out of my line for some for some time. I've probably used my dryer all of a handful of times.
And it helps global warming. You're not burning the fossil fuels.
Yeah, it's surprising that given California's greenness, that something as simple as this took so long. But we also care how we look, I guess, in California.
There you go. We'll get out and finesse the debris with the boxer shorts on the line. All right. Well, that was a rapid fire, but we covered a lot of ground there. We are going to shift to a new topic now. Some people are wondering if it's the same old song at the troubled San Diego Opera. The opera narrowly avoided closure in 2014 due to shaky financial underpinnings. Now comes news that the man hired as executive director in March left behind a secret blizzard of bills at his former employer in New York City. Now here's David Bennett, that man, talking about the San Diego Opera's finances in an interview at KPBS right after he was hired there in March.
We're working for that and trying to see what we can do probably for a 5-year plan to make sure that we're moving towards sustainability. I think we have a budget that's has been passed for the next season. That is a balanced budget. But one of the things that we can look at is when you start producing opera in different ways. So you have many modes of presentation. You have the ability to attract different kinds of donors and additional donors, I think. So sort of an expanded portfolio of opportunities for support.
All right. So, Angela, it sounds like he's got a handle on it there, but tell us what you learned was the case in New York.
Well, the Gotham announced at the beginning of the month that they were shutting down, and the executive director who took over for David Bennett discovered in the first few months of his job that there was all of this unpaid debt to the tune of about $600,000, and that none of it was put on the books. It wasn't, in the accounting system, and that the board didn't know about it. So they tried all summer to raise some money to make themselves, feel better about that they could actually pay it off, and they couldn't raise the money, and so they voted to shut down.
And how did they wind up discovering this? You said it wasn't on the books.
Right. So Edward Barnes, who was the new executive director who took over, when he was hired, he was told about $100,000 of the debt.
Thought they could manage that. But
he thought, yes, we could manage that. We could pay it off. But then when he got on board in those first few months, he started to receive phone calls from artists, from vendors, from theaters where there were agreements of shared revenue. a photographer, and so forth, and people saying, where's my money? And so when more and more of this started to happen, he then tasked a few staff members within the office to go back and look at old contracts and start calling people and seeing what other kinds of unpaid debts were out there. And then that's how he discovered the other $500,000.
So what has Bennett had to say about the $600,000 hole back there?
Well, he's issued a statement, and in that...
He wouldn't do an interview.
That's right, that's right. And in that statement, he basically said that in the course of the transition in leadership, that the board, in his words, finally grasped what he and the small staff there had known for a long time, which was that, again, his words, the financial condition at the Gotham was much more perilous than they had ever realized or grasped.
All right, but we don't have an interview. It's hard to really,
maybe
ask him the follow-ups on that.
Maybe, and I'm just guessing here, maybe they didn't realize the perilous situation because the debts weren't on the books. Mm-hmm, yeah. Do you suppose that had anything
to do with it? It kind of begs that question, doesn't it?
It does beg that question. It does, yeah.
So I was going to say, what was David Bennett's reputation as head of the opera? In other words, why was he attractive, and why did they want to bring him here to San Diego with our problems?
Well, so his role at the Gotham is very different than what it will be here, and what it is here. At the Gotham, he was the managing director, so he was in charge of the administrative and the financial side, right? And there's a longtime artistic director there, so his role was really to financially support the artistic vision of that director. He was like the producer on a Hollywood film, keeps everybody on task, keeps them on budget, he produces the operas. Mm-hmm. Here, he's the general director. He's very much more on the artistic side. The San Diego Opera is a much bigger organization. It's got an $11 million annual budget. The Gotham has just shy of $2 million, so much different. They have the San Diego Opera, that is, has a COO and a CFO on staff. So he's not going to be in charge of paying the bills here. That being said, he is the face of the organization. He'll be a central force in its fundraising, and obviously a decision maker in decisions that will have impact on the finances of the organization.
Now, the San Diego Opera Board, did they have any idea that Bennett had left behind this legacy of debt back there in New York?
No, they couldn't have, because the Gotham board didn't know. Nobody knew. I mean, Edward Barnes said, well, presumably nobody knew. I mean, Edward Barnes says that there was one person who was in charge of the finances at the Gotham, and that was David Bennett. He was in charge of monitoring those bills and putting them into the accounting system. So presumably nobody else knew. And the board says that at the Gotham that they didn't know. So the San Diego Opera Board couldn't have known.
So now we've got this revelation here. What's their reaction? What do the board members have to say and the head of the organization?
Another statement. The president of the board issued a statement, Carol Lazier, and she says that the San Diego Opera Board stands behind David Bennett 100%. She cited the kinds of things that I mentioned about the internal financial controls that the San Diego Opera has in place.
The whole different situation.
Right. I mean, the Gotham Opera Board didn't even have a finance committee. I mean, they had a treasurer, of course, but they didn't even have a finance committee, whereas the San Diego Opera Board has a finance committee. I mean, it's two very different animals.
Okay, let's review a little bit the troubles we had here. What were the problems? Give us the high points of what the opera faced and how they came to the brink, and they're still operating, obviously.
Right. So in March of 2014, the longtime CEO actually of the company, Ian Campbell, and a group of longtime board members convinced the overall board to vote to shut the organization down, citing declining ticket sales and dried up donations. And so
problems operas have had everywhere in the country.
Right. And they said they couldn't, they say that their reasoning was they were being financially prudent, that they could not produce the kind of grand operas that San Diegans wanted and still pay off their creditors in the future. So they wanted to shut the organization down so they could pay everybody off and be sort of clean about it. Members of the board then revolted, and that leadership that wanted to shut it down ended up resigning. Ian Campbell was asked to leave the company. They held a big crowdfunding campaign that raised $2 million, and now the opera is stable.
Yeah, stable. I want to get into that a little bit in the time we have left. So how are we doing now? How's the opera been doing in recent seasons now after this turmoil?
The 2015 was their 50th anniversary season, and according to an opera spokesman, they came in 99% of their ticket goal and 98% of their revenue goal, and they ended the fiscal year with a surplus about $300,000. So, I mean, but they're coming off of a lot of media attention as well, right? Which has helped them quite a bit.
That helped.
So,
and as you say, the big Jubilee year, and
exactly.
people come out, and we want to save the institution and all of that. So the question going forward now, maybe this new news, is this going to impact membership and the ticket buyers?
You meaning the news related to
Yes.
David Bennett? Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell. You know, I think what's going to be more important to your average San Diegan is whether they want to spend the money to go see an opera or if they're going to see anything new. And I think that, you know, David Bennett does want to do operas in unusual locations, and he is known for being a part of an organization that does that kind of thing. So we could see some really interesting programming from them. In that case, that might get more people out to the opera, but I think it's the same kind of problem that operas face all over the country.
All right, well, we'll keep an eye on that as we go forward. It'll be an interesting season again next year for the opera. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Andrew Keats of Voice of San Diego, Michael Smolens of the San Diego Union Tribune, and Angela Carone of KPBS News. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.